Okay. So moving on, let's talk about within subjects design. So we covered between subjects and match group design, match participants. Let's talk about within subjects, which is exactly what it sounds like. Here, you're going to use the same participants in all conditions. Okay. So if I was running a study comparing two different memory strategies, and I had say two conditions, um, in a between subjects design, I would have different people do one condition and different people do the other condition, randomly assigned. Within subjects, I could instead just have the same people do the first condition and the same people do the second condition. Okay. If I was looking at cell phones and driving again, I would have the same people do the condition with a cell phone, and those same people do the condition without the cell phone. Pretty straightforward. Yeah. Okay, so the logic here is actually similar to a matched groups design. Only rather than trying to actually match people up based on pre-measured attribute or extraneous variable, participants are really just matching themselves, right? So if I wanted to compare two weightlifting programs, I might if I was to run that within subjects, I don't really need to worry about this part. The fact that some people are going to have different baseline strengths because your baseline strength should be the same, whichever condition, because you're the same person, right? So I don't really need to worry. Maybe this is not the best example, but again, let's think of something like, say, cell phones and driving, where your baseline driving ability could be a strong extraneous variable there. Well, I don't really have to worry about that if I test you in both conditions, because so you're the same person, your baseline driving should not change, at least hardly change between conditions. Right? And another great thing about within subject designs, it's not the difference between that and a match design is a match design you can only match them on the thing you measure. So again, we kind of talked about how I can match participants 1 and 2 because they both have a 200-pound squat. That doesn't mean I'm matching them on other qualities. So, maybe they are different heights, different weights, different ages, genders. That could be another reason why they're going to be different and why they're going to respond differently to the condition, beyond the extraneous variable I did match them on. Can't match them on everything. You can, well, not exactly, but sort of do that with within subjects design because it's the same person. So every extraneous variable should be carried over between conditions. The other great thing about within subjects designs is that you actually need less participants. Obviously, because the same people are doing multiple conditions, you don't need as many people as if you have different people doing different conditions. So, for example, let's kind of look at these three designs we've covered, randomized, matched, within subjects, and how they affect the sample size. How many people do we need for each of these conditions? Well, in a randomized design, let's say we have three conditions and we want 10 people per condition. Right? Three conditions, we want 10 people per condition. Well, the total number of participants is going to be 30 if I used a randomized between subjects design. Because I want 10 per condition, I'm obviously going to three conditions, I obviously need 30 total. So that's not too bad, but again, randomized isn't the best for controlling extraneous variables. In contrast, a match design is going to need more. So match design is again obviously nice because I can better control for at least one extraneous variable, but I'm going to need at least 30, in reality more than 30, because I need to get 10 people per condition, but I also need to make sure that they match. So let's say I recruit 50 people from my sample, but only 30 of them are close enough to a different one, to another one, that I can match them. There's a match design. Within subjects, I only need 10 people because 10 people are going to do all three conditions. So that's a really nice thing about within subjects. Okay. All right. So within subject designs have a lot of advantages, obviously, like we just talked about, but there are some things you need to account for when doing within subjects design that if you don't account for can really threaten the validity of your study. Okay. So we'll kind of go over what those threats are, and then we'll talk about how we can address them, how we can sort them out. Okay, so before we go into them, let's kind of just look at logically what might be a problem with hypothetical study, and that'll kind of prelude these potential confounds, potential threats to validity that we're going to talk about. So let's say we ran a within subject design comparing or examining the effectiveness of a new anxiety medication for adolescents. So you recruit some 12-year-olds with their parents' consent. The study takes a year. The dependent variable is parental report of anxiety symptoms. So you give the parents some sort of measurement or survey to fill out, evaluate how anxious their child seems. Independent variable is going to be drug type or anxiety drug. So there you're going to get no drug, a new drug, or a placebo. No drug is obviously anything. New drug is getting the actual drug that we think is going to work. And then placebo, I don't know if we covered this, but a placebo is just like a fake drug. Placebos are fake drugs, so it's just like an empty pill. Placebos, the point of them is to basically account for expectation. So if you tell people, hey, here's this drug, it's going to improve your anxiety, or reduce your anxiety rather, a lot of times you get an effect, even if the pill is not actually doing anything. Even if you give them a blank pill, they just because they're expecting the pill to work, that actually produces changes in their evaluation and even biologically. Okay, so onto the study. So it takes place over a year. So they start in January, April, where they get no drug, placebo from May to August, and then the new drug from September to December. Just pause the video and take a minute and think about what are some issues with this study? What are they not? What would be some confounds? Again, we're going to measure the same person multiple times, or same people multiple times. So to pause the video, take a minute, put that, and then resume it. Well, this is a prime example of confounds because a lot of things are changing with our manipulation of anxiety drug type that are not our manipulation. So, namely, biggest one is that the adolescents could change over that time period. They could, I don't know, I think 12, 13 is average puberty age. They could start going through puberty. That would obviously be a con. Maybe they're more anxious about that, or maybe that distracts them from their anxiety. I don't know. That could be changing by condition, or along with the condition rather. So let's say they, start going through puberty sometime here in September. Well, that might have an effect that's co-varying with the manipulation. Right? Now you don't know, is it the fact that they started puberty here, or is it the fact that they started the drug? The other big one here is the time at which you're testing them, or rather getting their parents to report their symptoms. That could be another problem. People's anxiety levels will probably fluctuate depending on the time of year. So for 12-year-olds, they're probably going to be a lot less anxious in like July and August, June, I think, before, I don't know when school starts here for 12-year-olds, but they're probably going to be a lot less anxious when they're not in school and they're just having fun over summer, right? Maybe in September, when they're starting a new school year, or moving on to high school or whatever it might be, that's going to also be associated with increases in anxiety. Seems pretty plausible, right? That could be a serious problem for this study, right? Because again, if they're less anxious in July and August just because they're not going to school, well, now we don't know, is it the placebo potentially having an effect, or is it the time of year and things that are coming along with that, right? So kind of time related as well as participant related factors are not being accounted for in this study. So now let's look at those in detail. So some problems can arise within subjects' designs. One is that it's more demanding on participants. Okay, so if you have a lot of conditions that you want to do, or a lot of levels to your independent variable, running the same people through all those conditions can be kind of exhausting, and it can also lead to things like attrition, where they quit the study. So that can be a problem. Generally, as a general rule, if there are less conditions or the conditions don't take long, in addition to some other factors that we'll get to, within subject design is good. But there's some memory experiments, for example, that a friend of mine does, where the whole one condition takes like a full hour. So you're not going to run people through three hours of memorizing stuff and then testing. That's just going to kill them. So when a study is demanding like that one, you can end up with a few different problems. You can end up with attrition, where participants fail to complete the study. You can end up with carryover effects, and you can end up with testing effects. Okay, and I'll give you this is just kind of an overview, and we'll go into these in more detail, one at a time. So attrition is, again, participants failing to complete the study. Carryover effects can be when exposure to one condition affects performance in a subsequent condition. And then testing effects is where performance changes because you've taken the test before, for better or worse, but it's unrelated to your independent variable. Let's go through each of these in detail. But actually, sorry, before we do that, I just wanted to clarify one thing. A pre-test and post-test design is not the same as a within subjects design. Pre-tests and post-tests are not actually levels of an independent variable, usually. So, for example, your textbook gives the example of testing people's GRE scores, graduate record exam scores, and then doing an intervention and then testing again. This is a pre and post test design because you're measuring their scores once, giving them an intervention, and then measuring their scores again. Although you are measuring them twice, your main comparison is between this and this. After this is all going to occur with get mindfulness or nutrition between subjects, and then you're going to compare these two. So it's not the same as within subject design because you're still comparing two different groups of people at the end. Okay. All right. So in general, with carryover, you want to think about whether there's going to be any learning and whether there's going to be any contrast. So learning is, of course, when they don't just forget what you've taught them in a previous condition. If I run a memory experiment and they have to study a bunch of words, and then they do a test, then they do a different condition with new words, well, I have to be aware of some sort of carryover effect. So maybe the stuff they had to remember in the first condition is going to affect their memory of the next condition. It could make it better, could make it worse. Then the other one is contrast. So participants may compare treatments affecting behavior. Okay. So an example of that would be usually a lot of perception experiments. So like tasting something, if you taste something bad and then you taste something good, kind of the contrast between them might really make the good tasting thing taste even better than it would normally, right? And if you just had the good tasting thing with nothing coming before it. So that's an example. Okay. So learning and contrast can both be issues and sources of carryover. The another one is habituation. Okay. This is where repeated exposure to a stimulus may lessen responsiveness to that stimulus. Okay. So, for example, let's go back. Let's again think about weight training. If you're used to training at a high volume, meaning you train more, so you do more sets, more repetitions of a certain exercise, and then you transfer over to low volume, so you're training less. Well, you're going to be less responsive to training overall. The fact that you're going from kind of a more involved training program to a less one is going to make you less responsive than you might normally, because you've kind of already adapted to training at a higher volume. To kind of go and do less than that is going to make you less responsive than maybe if you just started out with low volume. Another example of this would be um, eating. A lot of studies on eating. You know how the best bite, you might have heard the phrase, the best bite is the first one. Well, there is science behind that. Usually, like if you bite into a donut or a chocolate bar or something, because your senses are not really adapted to it, that first bite always tastes the best. So it's kind of novelty. So repeated exposure to a stimulus may make you less responsive to that. In the case of chocolate, taking a fifth bite is going to be less impactful than taking the first bite. Repeated exposure is making you less responsive. Another one is dishabituation. This is where kind of getting used to one stimulus may actually boost responsiveness to a different stimulus. So, and again, just kind of think of all this stuff in terms of order. So if I, started out training high volume and then I trained at low volume, and the low volume is not as effective, not because it's low volume, but because of habituation, well then that's a conflict, right? Because it's really what I did before that's making low volume less effective, not just low volume itself. Okay. And again, the same thing would occur with, say, eating. So if you tried two different chocolate bars and the second one is you don't like it as much just because it's not your first bite of chocolate, well, then that could be a confound because maybe you don't like the second one as much just because you habituated, not because you don't like that chocolate bar. Okay, so on to dishabituation. This is where kind of getting used to one stimulus may actually make you more responsive to a different stimulus. Really, just anytime you kind of change it up, is that going to are you going to be more receptive to that stimulus um, than you would normally be? So let's say I start out training at a certain rep range. Maybe let's say I start training out at low volume, so doing less reps, and then I switch to high volume. Well, I mean, you could certainly argue that doing more volume, doing more lifting is going to be better. But maybe it's just the change, right? Maybe it's just the fact that now I'm lifting, you know, I'm just doing something different, right? I'm kind of gotten used to this certain way of training of maybe say lifting heavier weights, but less repetitions. Well, maybe switching to lighter weights, but at a higher repetition is just the fact that it's different is going to make me more receptive. In fact, there is actually evidence of that in lifting where kind of changing up your training a little bit, just changing the rep range weekly by a rep or two is better than just sticking to a constant range, because kind of your body gets adapted to doing the same thing over and over again. So if you can just modify that slightly, it's going to make you receptive, right? And then the last one, source of carryover, is sensitization. So this is where exposure to one stimulus might make you more responsive to a different stimulus. This again has a lot to do with perception research. So let's say you've been in a dark room, you've been trying to, looking at some sort of vision experiment, and you start out with dark stimuli or dark room, and then you move on to light stimuli and a lighter. Well, your rods and cones actually adapt depending on how light your environment is. So you become more sensitive to light when you're after sitting in a dark room for a while. There's lots of research showing that. So again, the issue could be that it's again kind of a carryover effect, not any effect of a manipulation you did. Maybe it's the fact that you were just looking at a bunch of dark stimuli and you become more sensitive to light. The light stimuli, whatever that might be, is kind of more having more of an effect than it would be normally because of the condition you just did, where everything was dark and your eyes adjusted. Okay, so those are issues of carryover. Let's talk about issues of testing. So the fact that you're going to measure people multiple times, you're going to give them a test multiple times, would probably have some effects, right? So when it comes to testing, there's kind of two things that can occur. One is fatigue, one is practice. So fatigue is kind of a straightforward concept. This is just what the name would imply, where participating in repeated trials can result in poor performance on later trials or later conditions. Okay. So let's think of our classic example of driving with a cell phone. So again, you take people to a simulation, driving simulator. They do the, let's say they start with the no cell phone condition, and then they do the cell phone condition, starting out as a control, and then they do the cell phone condition. We'd expect obviously that the cell phone is going to cause more mistakes for performance. Well, that certainly is the case, but couldn't it also be because they're getting tired doing cell phone condition second? So maybe they're making more mistakes because they're exhausted, frustrated with the experiment, they're bored, they want to get out of there. Maybe they just don't care as much, right? If that's the case, if they're getting fatigued, then they're probably going to make more mistakes in this, whatever the second condition is. And in that example, if they're doing the cell phone condition second, well, now we don't know. Now it's a confound because we don't know. Is it the cell phones causing them to make more mistakes, or is it the fact that they're just getting tired? Okay. And that can apply to a lot of memory tests or a lot of different tests, especially where you really want people to try hard, but the experiment is kind of demanding and tiring. The other way testing can show up is of course through practice. This is where practicing repeated trials can result in better performance in later conditions. So let's think about our driving experiment again. If you start out with in this kind of unfamiliar environment, this driving simulator, maybe the car doesn't really handle the way your actual car handles. Maybe it's different in some way. It's less responsive, more responsive, or whatever it might be. It's probably going to take you some time to get used to that, right? To get used to the driving simulator that you've never done before. Well, that could obviously be a problem for your experiment. Let's say you start out in some condition in the driving simulator, and then you move on to the next condition. Chances are you'll be better in the second condition just because you've gotten to practice using the driving simulator, right? It might have nothing to do with your experimental manipulation. It might just be because you practiced and got better at it, right? And again, let's think of that in terms of the manipulation. So let's say you start with your cell phone, and then move on to not using your cell phone. So if you start with your cell phone, do the cell phone condition first, and then you do the no cell phone condition. Well, I mean, we would expect that you would make less mistakes without a cell phone, obviously. But couldn't that also be because you're practicing and you're getting better, getting more used to the driving simulator? Again, that would be a confound because we don't know. It's not random and it's moving with the independent variable. Now we don't know, is it the cell phone manipulation, the fact that you're doing cell phones, or is it the fact that the cell phone condition came first and in the later condition you had more practice? Okay, so that's something to be aware of too. Break there.